and welcome to Operation Silver Screen. This is a special video recording of our interview of George Stevens Jr., the founding director of the American Film Institute and someone who has worked in the industry as a writer, director, producer, and playwright. He has won several awards, including multiple Emmy Awards, 2 Peabody Awards, and even an honorary Oscar for his lifetime contributions to the film industry. He comes from a family in show business. His father is the Oscar-winning director, George Stevens Sr., of the films Giant and A Place in the Sun. And when we had a chance to sit down and talk to him, we got to talk about his life experiences, his experiences in the film industry, and thoughts on things like film preservation. So I hope that you enjoy this recording. You can just kind of give us a quick summary of your background of film and really what started your interest in film, whether that's connecting with your father or being on set, or if there's other things in your background that really led to that.
I was born in the Hollywood Hospital, and my father then was a young director, and through time he became one of the most noted of film directors. But my own interest, when he came back from the war, he at the top of his career, after The More the Merrier and Woman of the Year, he enlisted, was commissioned as an officer in the United States Army, and he went overseas for 3 years. And General Eisenhower put him in charge of combat photography for the war in Europe, and he landed on D-Day with his unit, the Special Coverage Unit it was called, and he rode in a Jeep all the way across Europe, from Normandy to the liberation of Paris, the Battle of the Bulge, the link up with the Russians at the Elbe River, and the liberation of Dachau. So he was away for 3 of my formative years. But about a year or so after he came back, I had graduated from high school and I didn't have a summer job. And he said, well, maybe you can help me. So he gave me 2 assignments. One was to read Theodore Dreiser's An American Tragedy and do a notebook and list every character and every situation in parts 1 and part 2, because he was about to start the screenplay for A Place in the Sun, the film for which he won his first Oscar. And the other was to read books and scripts that came from Paramount Pictures, where his company was set up. And I was, 17 years old, reading treacly love stories that didn't interest me very much. But one afternoon, a small book was on the pile, and I took it up and read it in that afternoon. And I went to see my father that night, and he was in bed reading. And I walked in with the book, and I said, Dad, I think this is really a good story. I think you ought to read it. And he looked at me and he said, why don't you tell me the story? So I found myself walking around his bed, telling him the story of Shane. I had read Jack Schaefer's novel and found it very compelling. And as a result, the next summer, I was in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, and had a job called company clerk, where we were shooting Shane out under the Teton Mountains. And so that was really the beginning of my interest. And it led to, I worked with him on Giant. I went in the Air Force for 2 years and came back and worked with him on The Diary of Anne Frank, which was a very, very compelling and interesting experience, to tell the story of the young girl who'd written this book hiding from the Nazis in an attic in Amsterdam, and a book that over the years has reached 80 million viewers or readers. And the film is a film that, as we like to say, stands the test of time and is often seen today. So that was kind of my start. And then I had a big change. Uh, Edward R. Murrow, the famed broadcaster, and who worked at CBS and who told the story of World War II from London, um, had joined President Kennedy. President Kennedy asked him to head the United States Information Agency, which told America's story abroad in the Cold War. Um, Radio, the Voice of America, and they had a film and television division. And he asked me at age 29 to go to Washington and head the motion picture division of USIA. And that made me bi-coastal and led to a very different life than I had originally planned.
Now, your time at the USIA, now that also eventually paved the way to the creation of the American Film Institute. Can you tell us a little bit more about what your goals were with proposing the institute and what you hope to achieve through it?
Yeah, in those days, if you get, when you go from the West Coast to the East Coast, you'd find really smart people who would say, kind of condescendingly, "Well, I don't really go to the movies." That it was sort of uh, less than theater or symphony or opera, and that became sort of, a theme of mine in my work, that film should be given more respect, much as it is today. And so President Kennedy had initiated the idea of a national endowment for the arts, and it was enacted after his death. Um, and they didn't know what to do about film. They knew what to do about symphony orchestras and ballet and classical music. And I suggested an American Film Institute. And when Lyndon Johnson signed the legislation, he announced that we will create an American Film Institute. And I was asked to run it. And there were two major ideas. One was the preservation of American film. At that time, half of the films that had been made since at the beginning of the 20th century, were either lost or missing or had been destroyed. Films were made on nitrate film stock, which sometimes would just deteriorate, turn to dust in film cans. And the studios, thought they'd had the use of the film. They didn't realize that films would last forever or should last forever. So we started a film rescue program. And today there are 42,000 American movies in the AFI collection in the Library of Congress that have been preserved so people are able to see them today. And the other was the training of filmmakers. And we started what we first called the Center for Advanced Film Studies. We now call it the AFI Conservatory, that is in Los Angeles and is really the leading film academy in the country.
Now, what is the importance of film preservation to you personally?
Well, personally, I want to see those films. And if they'd been allowed to disappear, so many of my father's films and the films we revere today from the golden age of Hollywood would not be available.
Mhm.
So yes, it's personal to me because it adds to my enjoyment of life.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And I liked that you mentioned really seeing film as an art form. And I know, Bryant, you had a question as far as that goes.
AFI, it from what it seems like, it met that goal of preservation for film. Like you said, there's 42,000 films in the collection. What is the next step in ensuring film continues to be respected as a integral part of society and history? What do you think in today's time do we need to continue doing to make sure that it stays a first class art?
Yes, well, now film is very much recognized as an art. And the uh, I think just from the standpoint of the American Film Institute is nurturing uh, directors and writers and cinematographers who can contribute to that. In the early days of AFI, in the first class, there were uh, filmmakers Terrence Malick, David Lynch, Paul Schrader, and Caleb Deschanel. But over the years, Patty Jenkins, there's so many of today's filmmakers that are graduates of the AFI, and and I think they learn at AFI to have high aspirations and want to make films that respect the audience, and so I think that's kind of going along quite well.
Yeah, I was wondering how the role of the AFI has changed throughout the years, if it has to change or adapt at all in the modern film industry.
Oh, yes, it has. For one thing, in the early years of the first, it was not till our third year that we had a female fellow, as we call them, at AFI. And today, 53% of the fellows at the AFI Conservatory are women.
Wow.
And also, there's tremendous diversity in terms of filmmakers of color. So we have we have changed with the times.
Yeah, definitely. That's good to hear.
Yes.
Let me ask you another question. How has the topic of film preservation changed throughout the years? I know that we have a lot of discussions going on with streaming services and we have a lot of new technologies. And so I know that can make things a little bit more difficult when it comes to film restoration. So, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, there are many organizations that work in film preservation. The Museum of Modern Art, UCLA, universities, the Film Foundation that Martin Scorsese and Steven Spielberg had. So, there are they are finding films that need restoration, and also the idea of making films in 4K so that they have the high quality that's now possible in digital. So it's a continuing effort.
Gotcha. I know in your book you were talking about some of the issues with restoring older sound from, I think it was Shane that you
Mhm.
had mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, case by case, there are problems with the studios having lost negatives or lost the soundtracks, and you have to be resourceful. Um, and fortunately, there are wonderful technicians and technology today that enables the restoration of films um, to to be of the quality that they were when they were originally released.
And you obviously worked very closely in the government and with our nation's leadership. And what is the importance or role of the government in preserving film history?
Well, today, I mean, it's really the Library of Congress and the National Archives. They are repositories of a great amount of film, and they have their work and their efforts continue.
Yeah, we always make sure to mention when a film gets inducted into the National Film Registry
Right,
as part of their accolades for that film.
right. Uh, yes, of which A Place in the Sun and Giant
Hmm.
and The Diary of Anne Frank are all on it. Yes.
So you mentioned the phrase "the test of time." You mentioned it
Yes.
today, and you mentioned it a lot in your book as well. And you kind of mentioned how this was a defining phrase in your professional career.
Hmm.
So, what do you think makes a film survive the test of time?
the way this kind of came to me, I went to the Academy Awards with my father in 1952. I must have been about 20 years old, 18 maybe. And I sat with him, and Joseph L. Mankiewicz, who had won the Oscar for The Lady Eve the year before, came out and read the nominees. And he said, John Huston for The African Queen, William Wyler for Detective Story, Vincent Minnelli for An American in Paris, Elia Kazan for A Streetcar Named Desire, and George Stevens for A Place in the Sun. Now, of course, I wouldn't be telling you the story had not A Place in the Sun won the Oscar. But riding home that night in the car, the Oscar was on the seat between us. I'll never forget my father saying, "We'll have a better idea what kind of a film this is in about 25 years." Well, that was so different for those times because there were no DVDs. Films came and went. There was no streaming, and the idea that he, having come from the theater, appreciated that the real value of the film would be, did it stand the test of time with audiences? And of course, that kind of stayed in my head and led to my involvement in the American Film Institute and creating the Kennedy Center Honors, where we recognize the great figures in the performing arts whose work has stood the test of time. And, I think it just, you look at the films today that you watch and think, will I want to see this film in 25 years? And maybe it's hard for you to make that judgment, but having been around for a while, I see the films like the ones of that 1952 Academy Award group. Each one of those films has its place in film history. And so you look at the films of this year, and it'll be interesting to see which ones are with us in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 50 years. Do you get a sense of that when you think about films? I mean,
We do, because we talk about it a lot on our podcast, because every time we watch a film, we ask ourselves, does this hold up still?
yeah,
And it is kind of hard looking at more modern films because we just don't have that space to sit and see how it's gonna look in a few years. But sometimes I think you can tell.
yes, yes. Um, I think two films this year that will, I think, hold up. I think certainly Oppenheimer will. And I think Barbie may, that it's so unique and inventive. Uh, but, others will, because you can think back to films that were talking a lot about 10 years ago, new films, and you think about them, you say, oh, well, I'm not so sure I want to see that again.
Mhm.
Yeah, the
Yeah,
Barbie Oppenheimer thing was such a phenomenon too. I think the phenomenon itself is kind of its own kind of
Yeah.
point in film history now.
Yes.
yeah, they're already trying to do that again for next year.
Really?
Yeah, with Wicked and Moana 2, they're both releasing at the same time next year. But it's just with Barbenheimer, one of the great things about it is that it didn't feel forced. Like it just happened, and
It's very
everybody
organic.
just came
Yeah.
together and had fun with it.
Hmm.
Yes.
And it got a lot of people to the theater, so that's good too.
Hmm.
Yes, because I mean, one of my passions is I love watching movies on the big screen,
Hmm.
um, and the opportunities are fewer. Um, we have something at the Motion Picture Academy where I gave my father's papers to the Motion Picture Academy, to the Margaret Herrick Library, and now my papers and our films are in the archive at the Academy. And we have something called the George Stevens Lecture, where each year someone talks about a classic film. And this year was the first time we'd done it since COVID, and we did it in the new Geffen Theater in the museum, which has a splendid 33-foot high screen, just perfect projection. And I asked Christopher Nolan, because I'd read that Christopher Nolan, when he was making The Dark Knight, he did an interview, and he said that he'd watched Shane and was very conscious of its treatment of evil, uh, and also in any event. So he did the George Stevens lecture before a 70th anniversary showing of Shane on the big screen, and he talked about how he was influenced by George Stevens, and not only on Shane, and because the ending of The Dark Knight is almost the same ending as Shane. But he also
Yeah.
said in scouting locations for Oppenheimer, where they were building the factory for the manufacture of the bomb in the mountains of New Mexico, he said he had very much that one-sided street in Shane under the mountains in his mind when he was searching for locations. And so it's nice to make that connection uh, between filmmakers of today and how they were influenced by the work of others, um, and and also their consciousness of what films for them stand the test of time.
Mm, definitely. And I don't think I've made that connection before, but now I see the similarities so much with Shane. That's really interesting.
Yeah.
So let's hear a little bit more about your productions. Is there a production that you've worked on that you cherish the most?
Well, I'll talk about two.
Okay.
One, the first, uh, actually, it was 40 years ago. This film is that has its first 40th anniversary, and we are just now doing a transfer of the film into 4K, a digital uh, embellishment of it. But I made a film called George Stevens, A Filmmaker's Journey, which was a movie I made about my father. He died a few years before, and someone came to me and said, "You should write a book about your father." And I was kind of working at that, but he'd left a storeroom in Beacon Storage on Ventura Boulevard in North Hollywood, and he and I had visited that place together, and he saved everything, the scripts that he photographed in Laurel and Hardy, uh, uh, memorabilia from the war, cans of film, his scripts, a big locker with all of his Oscars and awards. Um, and suddenly I realized that the evidence of his life was in that room. And I decided to make this film about him. And it turned out to be tremendously successful and happily has stood the test of time. It was just shown on Turner Classic Movies a few weeks ago, and it's on the Criterion Collection. And to have had that opportunity to tell my father's story and have it last was a great pleasure.
I believe
And
it's also streaming right now on Max as well.
is it?
Hmm.
Thank you.
As
Yeah.
part of the TCM, the Turner Classic Movie Collection on there.
Oh, great. That's good to know. I didn't know that. Um, and another, I've always been interested in civil rights and social justice. And when I was at the United States Information Agency during the Kennedy years making documentaries, we made a film called Nine from Little Rock, which told the story of the students who entered the segregated Little Rock High School, and it won the Oscar for the best documentary film and won on the March on Washington, which is on the National Film Registry. Um, but I wrote a script um, about Brown versus the Board of Education which went to the Supreme Court, and Thurgood Marshall was the leader of the effort. and he argued the case before the Supreme Court to outlaw desegregation, to outlaw segregated schools. And it was Earl Warren, Chief Justice Earl Warren, who felt that a unanimous decision was very important. This law called Plessy versus Ferguson, which provided for segregated schools, had been in play for 70 years. And so this was a great change and the beginning of great change in the United States. And so we made this film called Separate but Equal, which tells the story of the case that came to the Supreme Court and the people in that case, with Sidney Poitier playing Thurgood, and Burt Lancaster played the role of John W. Davis, the most trusted lawyer in America, who argued the other side of the case. And the film won the Emmy. I wrote and directed it, and the film won the Emmy for Best Miniseries, was honored by the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and was very highly recognized. And it is standing the test of time. Turner Classic Movies is going to show it on March 21st, the 70th anniversary of the Brown decision this year.
Yeah, we'll have to see if we can watch that then. I definitely was looking into that one, and I know we've also covered some Sidney Poitier's films as well on our podcast. Great performer.
Yes.
Now, what production would you consider the most challenging of your career?
Gosh. They're all challenging. And because there are just always obstacles. A filmmaker's journey, I was afraid I wasn't going to be able to finish it because I was investing my own money and getting a few grants here and there. And then I made it in 35 millimeter, which was very expensive. But then it worked out, and getting in a position to make Separate but Equal was a challenge, because people were not, television networks were not receptive to serious drama. They were concerned that there would be, in fact, I took it to CBS, and they said, "That's a great idea, but you can't cast it." And I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "Well, who would you want in the role?" And I said, "Well, I would imagine I'd like Sidney Poitier." And the man says, "We've been to Sidney every year for the last 15 years, and he won't do television." But they said, "If you will come to us and can say that Sidney will read your script, we will pay for the script." Well, I thought about that, and I went up to see Sidney, and I told him the story and why I thought it was important, and then said, "I understand you don't do television, but we need 4 hours to tell this story." And he said, he had a kind of princely way of talking, and he looked at me and he said, "If you come with a compelling script on this subject, I will do it." And he sentenced me. So there was a writer's strike, and so CBS couldn't hire me. So I spent the summer writing the script, and I gave it to Sidney, and he said I wanted to do it. And so we went ahead, and he approved me as the director, and so that was one of overcoming some obstacles.
Yeah, I've worked on some productions myself in television, mostly from an assistant capacity, and I've worked on some indie films. And I know that you can prepare as much as you want, but there's always going to be something that goes not according to plan. But it is amazing to me how pieces do tend to fall together, especially when you have great people working with you.
Yeah, and you just have to believe, and when adversity comes, you just have to think, well, this goes with the territory, and
Mm-hmm.
how do we work our way around this?
Now, what is one of your favorite on-set memories? And it could be one of your productions or one of your father's productions or both.
I'm always interested um, in how directors work with actors. And I remember when I was in college going to Paramount Pictures on a Saturday. They used to work 6 days a week. And my father was shooting A Place in the Sun. And I went on the set, and here comes Elizabeth Taylor, uh, 18 years old, definitely the most beautiful woman in the world, and Montgomery Clift, who was just a formidable young actor. Um, and they were doing a scene, and they came in. It was a new scene. They were starting it. And my father said to Monty, he said, why don't you go in and find a place by the pool table that's comfortable for you. And Elizabeth, why don't you start at the door? And would just run through the scene. And so they did it, and the script supervisor was there with the script because, to give them lines if they weren't comfortable with their lines. And then they finished it, and my father said, that's nice. He said, why don't you let's just do it again. So they went back and they did it again. And he said, all right, well, let's just do it one more time. And they went and they did the scene again. And afterwards, Monty came rushing over and he had a question. And then Elizabeth came over and I saw them, the three of them talking, and then they went back and then Dad worked with them and they changed some things and got the scene ready to shoot. And later I asked him, I said, why did you have them do it 3 times before you gave any guidance? And he said sometimes it's important for actors to know they need some help. In other words, rather than him just coming in and saying, you do it this way and that way, he wanted to let them explore their own ideas. And then at that point, they were ready for some directing.
Mm-hmm.
I later did a play called Thurgood, based on Thurgood Marshall that ran on Broadway, and Lawrence Fishburne did it on Broadway. But before that, James Earl Jones had done it in Westport, Connecticut. And my playwright friend John Guare came to see it. And actually, the play was really working quite well. And John complimented me. And I said, well, do you have any thoughts? And he said, yeah. He said, he comes out and he's telling us all this. And I kind of, as an audience member, wonder, why is he telling me all this stuff? And he said, it'd be great if there were a reason, a frame. He says, you have 13 minutes to get the audience with you. And if you don't have them by then. And it was such a framing idea that I then made it that Thurgood Marshall was talking to the law school at Howard University, where he had graduated. And all of a sudden, he knew the actor knew who he was talking to, and there was a reason, and it just made the play work. And I was always grateful for that playwright's experience of John Guare. But in terms of on the set, we started work, and Sidney and I were friends, but I hadn't been directing. At the time I was working with my father before I went to Washington. I directed Alfred Hitchcock Presents and Peter Gunn when I was in my 20s, but I'd been doing other things. And but anyway, Sidney was great to work with, and we started in a scene in South Carolina where he goes to the church where it's basically, the story is about a boy named Harry Briggs who had to walk 5 miles to school every day and walk home, and in the film, we see the school bus passing him, covering him with dust. And it was his father, a World War II veteran, who filed a complaint, and the citizens of Clarendon, South Carolina joined it, suing for a bus for the Scotts Branch School. And so that basically is the story. And Sidney, at the beginning, he comes to a church and he talks to the people in the church uh, and urges them to sign this complaint. And he, as the lawyer for the NAACP, will take it to the court as part of Brown versus the Board of Education. And Sidney was wonderful and played the scene. Then we came back to New York, a scene in a soundstage where was all shot in South Carolina, but that we'd built. And Sidney comes back late at night and puts his briefcase down, and in the room in the NAACP offices, three of the lawyers are playing poker. And Sidney comes in and sits down and joins the poker game. And in that scene, he's going to tell them about the minister and about the Clarendon County case. But first they play a hand of poker. And Sidney, I had not seen the films he'd made with Bill Cosby, the comedies. And Sidney was sort of kind of loose and funny and doing, and it kind of threw me off. And because I was, taking this more seriously, not without humor, but so I kind of changed the lighting and then took Sidney aside. We ended up in a room full of lamps and some props and all, a dark room. And I'm standing here with this wonderful man. And I say, Sidney, I'm not sure quite what we're doing here in this scene. And I just wanted to. And Sidney looked at me and he said, what would you like in this scene? And I said, uh-oh. And I don't know where it came from, but I said to him, I think of Thurgood Marshall as a man with secrets. And Sidney's the long pause. And he said, whenever you want that, just say that word. And we went on from there, and we'd never had another hiccup of any kind in 2 months of shooting. But creating a relationship with actors, it's funny. And Burt Lancaster, this was Burt's last role. Okay, he was a wonderful man, a wonderful actor, had a black Irish temper, and he was losing his memory. I mean, and he'd say to me, he said, I used to stay out all night and come in, and the script girl would give me 6 pages, and I'd sit in the makeup chair and learn it. He says, now, he said, I have trouble learning my lines, and it just drives me crazy. And sometimes, he'd just explode when he couldn't remember his lines. But we had these big scenes in the Supreme Court, and I was concerned about that with these long speeches. And I said, Burt, I could get a teleprompter, and kind of bury it in the back of the set if you'd like to have those words up for you. Then he said, God, that'd be great, thank you. And I mentioned it to Sidney, and Sidney kind of shrugged. He was not impressed with that. He was, in any event. So Burt comes in and he does his scenes, and it's really excellent, And that night, Sidney came and he said, do you think you could put my copy on that machine? And so, he learned that was a tool because, these court cases, it's very extensive dialogue, and it gave them both the ease. They didn't stand and stare at it, but if they were off track or something, it was easy to catch it, and not ruin the scene.
It seems like you learned a lot watching your father too about how to work with actors too, because I know every director kind of has their own kind of methods and style.
Yeah. Yes. No, that was it was a gift. I see him, just at when I was 18 to be on the set right near the camera on Shane and see how I worked with a little boy in Shane and different actors and Broadway actors and Hollywood actors and how to make them comfortable with one another. Um, One of his first rules is just to get a situation where the actors can be comfortable, and his sets were always very quiet, and nobody's shouting action, or quiet. He didn't want to get the actors just in that mood, particularly, say a sensitive scene or a love scene, and all of a sudden the assistant director rings a bell and shouts, quiet. All of a sudden that's the actors in a slightly different place.
Yeah.
Where did your interest in civil rights begin? Because I mean, you definitely can tell that you have an interest in it. I was reading the memoir, you discussing it with Obama, and having watched your father's movie Giant. I think Giant actually has like a genuine theme and message as far as equality goes. Is that something that stemmed from your father, or is that something you picked up elsewhere?
I think things like that often come from your family, and my mother and my father were very uh, fair-minded people, and yes, and on Giant, watching those scenes, and seeing the film, that he, and when you think of a blockbuster, that which Giant was, was the most successful picture in Warner Brothers history. But you think of, and it isn't a picture of the outdoors, but in fact, the ending is two women, excuse me. In fact, the ending is a husband and wife in their late 50s, grandparents, and there's a crib with a white child and a brown child, and that that the picture didn't end with a chariot race. It ended with this very intimate scene of a man, the role played by Rock Hudson, who had been intolerant uh, uh, of his the Mexican Americans on his ranch, had seen that his grandson is a child of color, and that the warmth and of that ending and the insight. And then on the Diary of Anne Frank, Bryant, but my father and I went to Europe, and he and I went together to Dachau, where he had seen and photographed the worst in human history of depravity in terms of treating human beings. And then we went to the Normandy beaches, and I walked with him on the beach where he landed on D-Day, and we talked about it. And then we went to Amsterdam and to a little office building on a street, and we rang the bell, and a tall man with balding with white hair, standing very straight, welcomed us, and it was Otto Frank, the father of Anna Frank, the author of the diary. And we went in and sat with him, and he was looking at the man who was going to tell his story, his daughter's story, on the screen. And we were there to learn as much from him as we might. And he went to a filing cabinet, it served as coffee, and he opened it and brought something out in cloth and unfolded it. And in front of us was Anne's diary in her handwriting with the pictures pasted in, and you saw that this work of this little girl, this young girl, had outlasted the voice of Adolf Hitler, and then Otto Frank took us to the Prinsenkracht, where the building, the spice factory, where they had hid on the top floor from the Nazis behind a bookcase, bookcase door. And so in those experiences, I was just had the opportunity to identify with outsiders, as you will. And I think it just kind of became part of my life, that, fairness and equality are basic to the way we should be living our lives.
That's great to hear.
Yeah, I definitely think it's fortunate to have a family like that as well.
And as you read in my book, I had the opportunity to meet Barack Obama long before he was thinking of running for president, or a year or two before, and had the really just the great experience of being with that process from before it started, all through. And I think that one of the great pleasures of my life was being in Grant Park in 2008, when CNN declared that Barack Obama had been elected president, and we knew we were going to have our first African American president.
Like, I mean, already it's a great moment. Anybody can imagine why, but like, just from your point of view, I couldn't imagine just your interest in it, and from growing up in your time, and finally seeing a moment like that must have been something else.
It really was, Brian.
Yes. So, I mean, you have so many accolades. I know you're aware of them. You went ahead and wrote a memoir about your life. I was wondering, at what point did you realize that you were a significant individual in film's history? Like, what moment did it click for you?
Oh my God, that's a tough question.
Mm.
Then I'll think about it, because I mean I wrote this book, and that also is kind of a voyage of discovery.
Hmm.
And I used to joke that when I was working with my father, that I had a very likely opportunity of devoting my life to becoming the second best film director in my family. Um, and I think I am the second best film director in my family, but I managed, by virtue of this change of direction, when I went to work with Edward R. Murrow and founded the American Film Institute and made films of my own. Um, and when did I don't think I can answer your question, because it's a gradual thing, and to try
Hmm.
and put a pinpoint, that somewhere along the line I said, "Oh man, I'm somebody."
Yeah.
uh, but as the Film Institute became established, and my work, we started to winning a lot of awards, and you begin to get a pretty good feeling that you know, President Kennedy, who I admired so much and was inspired by, had wonderful quotations, and he read history and understood history and cared about it. And one of them was, he used to refer to the Greek definition of happiness, which is the fullest use of one's powers along lines of excellence. And I just thought that had such a ring of truth. And suddenly I realized that here I was working for Edward R. Murrow in the Kennedy government, in contact with President Kennedy, making 300 documentaries a year with new young filmmakers. And I realized I was living the Greek definition of happiness, the fullest use of my powers, hopefully along lines of excellence.
Well, we're definitely thankful for you being able to share your insight and your knowledge. I think even that is a part of preserving that film history, and I think that's really important.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah. Um, just one other President Kennedy's quotes that led to something. Um, he, in one of his speeches, actually at Amherst University, it was a dedication of Robert Frost, who was an Amherst graduate. And in that speech, he said, I look forward to an America, President Kennedy said, I look forward to an America that will not be afraid of grace and beauty, that will reward achievement in the arts the way we reward achievement in business and statecraft. And that is basically the idea of the Kennedy Center Honors. Those words are carved on the front of the building. And when I proposed the idea of the Kennedy Center Honors to the chairman of the Kennedy Center in his office, I said, I have an idea. And I said, it's all encompassed in the words on the front of the building. And I told him, and that led to us starting the Kennedy Center Honors, where we would honor each year 5 people who had distinguished careers and enriched American culture through the arts in the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts.
Now, I have one other question for you. So I know you mentioned, kind of looping back around to our earlier conversation that we had, you said that you were really involved with the Center for Advanced Film Studies, and you did a couple workshops. You were involved with those. There was a workshop for women that you were involved with. And I want to know, what advice can you give young filmmakers and those who want to get really involved in the industry and production as a business? What advice do you have for them?
I start with first, if you're going to have, a responsible, important role in it, it's a challenging discipline. That don't go into it thinking, oh, it's going to be fun and easy, and then today, which is different. When we started the AFI Conservatory, people didn't have phones with cameras. You had to get a 16 millimeter camera. With 8 millimeter cameras were around for a while. But today, everybody thinks more cinematically, and so many people are making their own films. So, you can be quite far along, and you're going to know more about it as you go into it. And you can go to school. You can go to UCLA or NYU or any of the film schools, or the AFI's conservatory, which is a little more advanced or intended. Many people come from UCLA or the film schools to AFI. And just keep your eyes open. And you may think, I want to be a director. Everybody wants to be a director, a storyteller, a writer, director, auteur, whatever. But if you come into it and you find your way, you may find that you're more suited to something else. You may really be a wonderful cinematographer, or you may become interested in production design or producing. So keep your eyes open, work hard, be collaborative, and be brave.
That's good advice.
Yeah, it's great advice.
All right, then I think that about wraps up the time we have. And if you guys want to learn more about his life, I recommend checking out his book, My Place in the Sun: Life in the Golden Age of Hollywood and Washington. And we'll also leave a link to his website in our episode description as well. Do you have any parting words for our audiences?
Well, I've enjoyed being with you, Kate and Bryant, and that My Place in the Sun, if you fancy Audible books, it's on Audible and Spotify, and you can listen to the book. And just to say thank you for inviting me to be on your terrific podcast.
We were very happy to have you. Thank you for joining us.
I would say also, your book, while it is a memoir, and if people want to learn more about your life, it's a great book to read. But I'll also say, if you're just interested in film in general and filmmaking, it's it's a great book just because, like, just from, from starting in the golden age of Hollywood up into modern times, seeing it from your point of view, it's it's interesting in that own right as well. So I'll definitely recommend it for anybody out there, whether they're interested in your life or just interested in film.
Yeah, we'll definitely have to share the Audible link to that as well in our description. And in the meantime, if you guys are interested in hearing more from us and some of our normal episodes, we're going to be talking about A Place in the Sun. We do have an episode about that. I think it will be out by the time this one airs. So if you want to take a listen to that, we are on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts, but also you can connect with us on social media. We're on Twitter and Instagram at OpSilverScreen. On Facebook, we're at Operation Silver Screen, but Twitter and Instagram, that's OpSilverScreen. Bryant, do you want to wrap us up?
So till next time, again, thank you, Mr. Stevens. It's been a great pleasure having you on this show. As far as like having our first interview, we could not have a better guest. You have really set the bar for who we're going to have on this show.
Thank you.
So till next time, I'm Bryant.
And I'm Caitlin.
See ya.